It wasn't.
Right at that moment, you could see what was going on in your life and what was taking place, and almost everybody that gets on a path has a moment. Now, it was interesting. We were talking about Charlie Sheen earlier. I heard you and Judah rapping about that.
Yep.
When you listen to Charlie Sheen, he's stuck in what we call a sincere delusion.
Yep.
And it's an interesting term, isn't it? Because he so believes what he is saying. I mean, he's so convicted that this is the truth, right? I mean, we see that conviction.
He's trying to bargain within his denial.
I heard you say it. Yeah. That's a great term. And Vern Johnson, who is one of the founders in the field of this chemical dependency stuff, coined the term sincere delusion. I love it because you could just see that manifested.
Well, it seems that people will actually, it's your own reality, right? Where he's created this reality for himself. Where it seems to me like he's on his fingernails in the cliff, just like
exactly what he looks like.
I'm fine.
That's exactly what he looks like. And see, you had that moment of clarity where you just said, "Hey, look at what's really going on. Let me get honest with myself." And everybody that starts the path has that moment where they get honest with themselves, where they really see themselves as they are, not as they'd like to see themselves, not as they'd like to believe themselves to be, but as you truly are at that moment.
Right.
See,
it's also very freeing too. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's very freeing because then, like I said, there's to err is human, and God disciplines those that He loves, and you learn by trial and error. So to let go of that and to accept that, I guess, at the moment of clarity, but to accept being human and be, it's okay. It's good to make a mistake and to own up to that and embrace it. It's a huge, like, this burden off my shoulders was enormous.
But see, addiction tells us that's what right is wrong and what's wrong is right. See, that's the message that addiction gives us. What's right is wrong and what's wrong is right. That's how, because we know it hijacks the brain.
Well,
see, that's the interesting
let me
thing.
ask you a question then, and I'm just relating this to myself. I always knew that I always used to say to people, I was raised in an Orthodox home. I wore a yarmulke until I was 17, so I had never eaten shrimp, lobster, anything like that. And after I left my faith a little bit, as you say, I still never did those certain things.
Right.
And I always somehow in myself believed that I was going to be okay if I just held on to something. Something of my youth, something of my childhood, that I never got so far down the scale that I couldn't
that indicated that you weren't that.
And I know that it was just in a crazy irrational fear, but I was living in a halfway house in Mesa, Arizona, run by the Hells Angels. And I don't mean a sober living. I mean a halfway house, with criminals and me.
From Israel to Mesa.
I know. Israel, right.
That's my memoirs. Those are my memoirs.
An international alcohol.
And I remember I'll never forget, I was sitting in this halfway house, and I meet this woman she was dating one of the criminals, and she goes, and it was really funny. I was sitting with them all night, and they were all complaining about taxes, and I realized this wasn't a good time to be smart, and I didn't realize it, and I said it, and I go, well, at least you know where your tax dollars went, and paying for them to go to jail, and this woman goes to me, she goes, your name's Judah? She goes, I don't like your name. And I should have stopped, and I go, why not? She goes, well, you betrayed my Lord and Master. And I was like, I've had a few blackouts in my day, but I don't remember killing Christ. And but so I was in this.
Judas.
So right, so you got confused with Judas, and but I remember just sitting there. And my mother had gotten me this Star of David, and I remember thinking, as long as I just hold on to this,
that's interesting.
I am not fully gone, and because I always knew it's like that song by Eric Clapton. I remember I used to listen to Tears in Heaven and think to myself, if I died, would my grandfather just recognize me? So I wasn't that guy. I didn't want to. I knew I was going down, but I didn't want to lose. I just knew there was something there.
Well, see, that's where this idea about the brain being hijacked is really interesting, because there's a part of us that has a sense that something's wrong, right? But we can't seem to stop the train.
Yeah.
That's what's happening here, is there's no brakes on it anymore. At some point in time, we cross that line and we can't find the brakes. And that's really the addiction part of it. See, so we lose our autonomy. We lose that ability to make choices that you were talking about before. I love what you said. God, now while I'm clean and sober, I can make some choices about what I want to do with my life. Before that, we don't have that autonomy in our life. And we don't realize we don't have it. See, that's the
terrifying
thing.
That's
man.
the terrifying
There's a
thing.
recurring theme that we've been talking about. One is that, spirituality is is a big issue in addiction, and it comes with a lot of baggage because there's been such a moral stigma to drinking for such a long time, and I think that's affected how people view religion and spirituality within the issue of addiction. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think, to some extent, there is still a level of personal responsibility where a person has to decide, you know what, I'm not going to drink and I'm not going to use drugs no matter what. And they have to have like some sort of core within themselves still. So how do you approach
NA
that?
says it. This is the way that Narcotics Anonymous says
Right.
it. I am not responsible for having my disease, right? My disease is not my fault, but I am 100% responsible for my recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that. See, that's the line that I draw in this thing. Yeah, we have this thing we know now today. There's a big genetic influence. There's all kinds of cultural influences. We talked about it. This society is a drinking-oriented culture. Let's face it. So
it's funny because alcohol is such a horrible drug in some ways, right?
I know. Think about it.
It makes people throw up all the time.
All kinds of
right?
stuff.
Right?
Every night.
DUI,
What do you mean so much?
Domestic violence,
Right.
incest in
Just go to
family.
an ER on a Saturday night
Well,
and the
yeah, I
smell
would.
of alcohol.
Yeah, I know.
What's
It's
this line here where people are like, I'm
come
a
on.
good drunk.
It's across
Yeah.
the board. But yet, this whole culture's oriented to it. Like you said, turn on the TV. In 2 hours, how many ads are you going to see for alcohol?
Well, I was sharing this a few weeks ago when I was a kid. There was this paper around for a while called The National. It was like this all-sports paper. And on the back page for Christmas time, it used to say, Ingle-L's, Christmas just ain't the same without J and B.
Right.
And I remember
that
seeing
one.
this ad going, oh, my God, that's the greatest, And, like, I thought it was just the greatest ad. And I show it to my dad, who was, who worked in that business. And he goes, yeah, it's a cute ad. But for me, it was like, oh my God, this like revolutionary ad for J and B.
That's how we sounded when we drank and started singing.
But I remember, I saw Ironweed as a kid. Most people, that movie would be really disturbing to. I was like, I could see that happening to me, And I don't know if you've seen Ironweed, but it's not a very uplifting movie. And like leaving Las Vegas, I would watch it going, yeah, you drink it, Nicolas Cage, And I remember like wanting to do that, wanting to walk around Winn Dixies.
Getting back to like the real issue there. I mean, this issue of spiritual higher power, being able to do something versus individual responsibility and self. Because I always hear so many messages when people speak. Like David said, that for him, his mother made a statement that he took very personally, and he made a decision about that he felt, but then he also had this very sort of spiritual sort of experience at the same time.
But Carl Jung was huge with that.
Well, David just went through. I mean, really, the basis. My life is devoted to love and service, and to be a better person in my life, and to be accountable. And so I'm an old school sober guy where I look at, one, it's none of my business how I became an alcoholic or an addict. It's just my business to do something about it. To your point, so. And with David, it's like, for me, it's like if somebody's doing the right thing and taking accountability and they're filling that spiritual hole and they're good people and they're trying to be better people, to me, it doesn't matter how they're doing it. It's great that they're doing it. You know what I mean? Like, and that's there's different ways in each program, but I think, like you said, it's all spiritually based. I was trying to fill a big empty hole in me with whatever I could get my hands on, and it's all different addictions. It could be food, drugs, alcohol, gambling, sex. It doesn't, whatever it is going to fill that hole. And then that one day when we have that moment of clarity and we say, all right, enough's enough, and I got to get help. I got a problem, and then but at the basis of it for me was a spiritual malady, and I had to find some power, as long as I wasn't it, greater than myself to pray. I pray every morning as well and every night.
Well, you're saying with spirituality, with alcohol, I guess in particular, is that it is associated because if you have a few drinks, you said after 2 or 3, you make bad decisions. I was home a couple of years ago for Christmas Eve, and you see things like you're like, I don't miss that. My uncle's like, I'm a good drunk. It's like, you just tried to French kiss my mom last night, asked that. And he did. It's like, you're not a good drunk. You're a moron. He tried to French kiss my mother in front of his brother. I'm just like, does that be in 40 years? I'm done. You know what I mean? It's like,
well, that is, it's Montana,
bad decision making. Yeah, it's
Montana.
Yeah,
probably raised him in Montana.
But it is so that therefore that it is a spiritual, it is a personal thing with accountability. And as far as going to parties and
But is there a difference between moral development and religious
Well, I
development?
think people misunderstand it, that there is. That's what you're talking about. There is a difference between religion and spirituality. You know, there is a difference between.
Well, it's just moral development.
Moral
but I think
development.
we live in a place though.
on that.
Well,
in
for
the,
example,
in the big
there's-
book, they
well-
call it moral psychology.
Right. So there are human secular movements, humanist movements, right, that believe that there's innate sort of beliefs and sort of central tenets about being a human being that are universal truths.
Yeah.
Right? And that they don't have to be attached to a religion. So you can be a very moral person and be an atheist.
Right. Just,
Maybe more moral than a lot of religious people.
well,
but-
accountable
Right.
behavior,
That's true.
Andrew, right?
Exactly.
No,
Right.
you're making a great point.
I would
Andrew.
agree,
That,
yeah.
That's a powerful point that you're
Right.
making.
Right.
The way I say it, in a lot of my writings, I talk about that it's what's right about us that we ignore that gets us sick. It's not what's wrong about it, but it's what's right about us. That's what Jung was talking about as well. It's what's right about us that we ignore that gets us really in trouble.
You know, my father, I had a really hard time when I got sober, you know, with the whole religious thing because, you know, my father's an observant Jew and who I love dearly. And I'm not it drives me crazy when people say this, that religion is for people that are scared of hell, spirituality is for people that have been there. And I'm always like, this very spiritual of you to say, you know. But I remember my father saying something to me to the extent, something's only really wrong if it's wrong to you. And when it becomes wrong to you, that's when you have to stop doing it. You know, and it took me a long time to really understand that because, you know, when you're raised with religion or you're raised, everything's wrong to you. You know, the first time I ate, you know, I ate non-kosher, I literally thought the heavens were going to come down and strike me down with furious anger, you know. And I went to my mom and I told her, and like, I was really scared.
I hope you started with bacon.
No, I didn't know. It wasn't even, it was like borderline not kosher. It was like a baked potato at like a non-kosher restaurant. And, but, you know, and as the more I've gotten sober, the more that rule that my father taught me about, you know, or said to me has become really the truth for me. It's like, you know, people always, you know, my political orientation is I'm a conservative, right? You know, and it's people always say, how can you be a Jewish conservative, you know? And I'm like, because I have no guilt, you know, and, you know, and it's one of those things I've become okay with who I am because I've always been willing to look at those things that I if it's wrong to me, if it's not wrong to
There's
me.
a Native American parable, Montana, but the Native Americans they have a belief that there's the two wolves within all of us, and that which the wolf that grows stronger is that which you feed the most. There's a good wolf and a bad wolf, and that, you know, by doing substances, or I think it's a number of things. You said, well, you know, when you're drunk, the true you shows up. Well, is that because you're unhappy in your marriage, your career is going poorly, you're pissed at your dad, or whatever it is? But it's not an excuse. Well, I was drunk. Get in touch with that. What's bothering you? What's the source of your frustration, your angst? You know, and embrace that and overcome it, or at least become friends with it. Feed the good wolf. If you're in a situation, you're listening to angry music all the time, and you're hanging out with people that are going to jail and getting fights a lot, you're going to be on that same path. You need to put yourself in better situations. You know what I mean? Feed the good wolf more, and I think you're going to find yourself in better, more harmonious situations. Right?
Well, it's like, you know, stick with the winners, you know, and I think
Right.
that's a huge, you know, it's like funny because there is a difference between judging and evaluating. And, you know, we're always like, don't judge, you know, don't judge. But you can evaluate. And I could look at a situation and assess a situation and say, I don't want to hang out with him. And I remember I was 10 months sober. And when you're newly sober, you'll hang out with anybody. You're not really like listening, or like you'll just be like, oh, they invited me out, I'm going. You know, and then one day you wake up and you start hearing what's being said. And then you might say, I want to hang out with these people. And I might not want to hang out with these people. And I remember we were all in New York and we were at this place called Sidewalk Cafe. And it was about 2 a.m. or 1 a.m. and all these guys that I had been to dinner with tons of nights, I start hearing these jokes that they're saying. And, you know, some of them are racist jokes, you know, some of them are not favorable towards Jews. And I remember just sitting around looking at them going, I got to go. I'll see you later. I paid my bill. I got up. I never saw them again. Yeah. And because at that moment I realized that's not who I want to be around. And that's okay who they are.
Right.
You know,
we just said when we were coming in, my father, you know, it always goes back to what my father used to tell me when I was in grade school. Don't tell me what kind of kid you are. Show me who you're hanging around with. You know, I mean, that's, you know, who you know, water seeks its own level, and I'm only as good as the company that I keep.